Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the evolving role of women throughout Canadian history. There are many topics that are usually overlooked and left deep below the surface. One topic of concern is the evolving role of women in Canadian history. We already had a vague understanding of how women were treated less than men, but why is this something that is nowadays forgotten? Today we will be looking at how women affected and were affected by historically significant events throughout Canadian history. World War I. During World War I, women were expected to stay home and take care of the homes since they belonged to the private sphere. The private sphere consists of work that is more or less housekeeping. Those who are in the private sphere really rarely interacted with the outside world and were expected to quote-unquote obey others, thus given little freedom. Now that World War I started, the men who were not enlisted in the Canadian Army worked in munition factories, where they manufactured ammunition, bombs, shells, cartridges, and other equipment. As we learned from the previous video on conscription and propaganda, the Canadian Army needed a lot of manpower, resulting in fewer men working at munition factories. This is where we see women being affected by World War I and what it brought to the table. Many thousands of women volunteered and were employed to work at these munition factories, taking over the jobs men were doing. Women felt a sense of importance, dignity, and honor when they received the opportunity to work in these factories. A small number of women were also part of the war effort. Around 3,000 women served as nurses, treating wounded soldiers on the war front, having significant impacts on soldiers' lives. Even in World War II, women continued to help the war effort. They weren't allowed to fight during both of the wars, but they did many other things. They worked in wartime industries, munition factories, worked as engineers, pilots, clerks, nurses, and much more. There was, however, a noticeable difference from World War I to World War II. Women were involved a lot more and had much more confidence to be working. World War I and World War II were two of many major events that had huge impacts on women. It was historically significant because it marked the beginning of a social revolution. Some would call it the turning point. Women had realized the true scope of their lives and how confined and restricted they were. They looked at how their role as women was to take care of their homes, but they wanted to do much more. They wanted to shift into the public sphere. As the war ended, the values of women changed, and so did their lifestyle. Many started to remain unmarried and started working jobs. All in all, were transitioning to becoming more independent. They would join organizations that were found through local churches, bringing like-minded women together. When talking about women and the impacts they have had on Canadian history, it is extremely important to mention BIPOC women. Indigenous woman Catherine Sutton was an activist who fought for land rights. As a part of an Ojibwe family, she was determined to get land rights back for her people. She had found out that the Canadian government had owned the land and went to fight for her family's land rights. The government did not give the land back but had sold it to her white husband. This displays how powerful determination can be. She is just one of many examples of strong BIPOC women who stand up for what's right. The women's suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement was a movement in which the main focus was to get voting rights for women. As World War I ended and women became more independent and politically aware, they started questioning their rights. They did not have the right to vote, and the women's suffrage movement had begun. Women in Manitoba started to win rights and even climbed to hold provincial office positions. By 1917, though, women in the armed forces and female relatives of military men earned the right to vote federally. We start to see this movement becoming successful, at least for some women, because by 1918, Indigenous women were allowed to vote, but there's a catch. They can only vote if they give up their status and treaty rights. This was very clearly put in place to make more Indigenous women lose their status. Typically, most suffragists were white women, but one great example of a non-white suffragist woman was Mary Ann Shadd. Mary was the editor of the Provincial Freeman. She used her newspaper as a platform to discuss women's rights. She informed her readers about suffragist meetings and about the status of the situation. She, as a black female, was marginalized in many ways, but she still found methods to spread the word and help fix the situation regarding women's right to vote. As a BIPOC individual, who's also a woman, you are at least socially accepted and are marginalized in two different areas. This makes life a lot harder. Even if women earn rights, they would have to fight for BIPOC rights as well. Finally, in 1925, black and white women earned suffrage in all Canadian provinces. After years and years of effort, they gained the right to vote federally. This movement banded people together socially, and it completely changed the way the average person looked at the government. Political figures and entities are rarely ever reasonable with their actions and decisions, and have little to no respect and care for social problems. This changes when large amounts of people demand change. Since so many people were against the government for restricting voting rights for marginalized communities, the government was forced into changing many things to calm everyone down. Political figures had to pretend that they too cared about the situations so that they could save their reputation or be more favored in the next elections. This continues to happen today, all around the world. They only say what the people want to hear. Agnes MacPhail was a very important woman who became the first woman elected to the House of Commons. She fought for equal pay and equal work for women, which later in the future helped grow in the economy, seeing a lot more women pursuing dream jobs that they previously could not do. She also fought for countless other human rights issues. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women is a movement that advocates for the termination of violence against Native women. Around the time of 1980 and 2012, about 1,180 Indigenous women were reported missing or murdered. Indigenous people usually live on reserves, with horrible living conditions. They are treated differently because of their background and past with Canada. Their living status make them easy targets, seeing how they are far away from police stations and central cities. If I were to put myself in the shoes of an Indigenous woman living in Canada, I would instantly be aware of how others would treat me differently. There are still a lot of cruel people out there who believe that the residential school system was successful and was a good choice. I would personally feel very scared and paranoid, waking up every morning knowing that there are people out there that want you gone. It isn't a great feeling. There's also a lot of transgenerational trauma that is present in Indigenous communities. If an Indigenous person's ancestor went to residential schools, that trauma would be passed on to the next generation, and the next, and so on. It gets progressively worse, and this trauma could lead to alcohol and drug abuse, as well as violence. Now that we have looked at numerous different historically significant events, how they impacted and were impacted by women and BIPOC women, as well as a journey that Canadian women went through to gain voting rights, we can narrow it down and find the most life-changing events that women in the 1900s would have faced. If I myself put myself in the shoes of a Canadian woman during the 1900s, I would honestly go out of my way to say that World War I was the most life-changing event that I would have experienced. This is because it was the start of a revolution and realization which snowballed, expanded exponentially, ultimately leading to women getting the suffrage they deserved. After getting the opportunity to work in munition factories, while at the same time socializing with others, they started to wonder what else they could do, expanding their horizons and interrupting the social norms, making the private sphere, public sphere idea obsolete.